Hey everyone, I'm back with another story. Keira moves her family to a new home. After her daughter, Ellie, comes in. She notices strange paintings hanging on the wall. Keira says they came with the house. She plans to deal with them later. While exploring the house, Ellie accidentally finds a door in the hallway. Her dad, Brian, says it's the cellar. Curious, the family goes inside. They find it dark and dirty. They think there's nothing to see, and leave. As Ellie leaves, she glances back at the cellar. As she's about to exit, the door suddenly closes by itself. Brian quickly tries to open the door, but the door won't open. Seeing her parents can't open the door, Ellie becomes scared and anxious. She feels something crawling up from the cellar. At a critical moment, Keira finds the key in the door just in time. Brian grabs the key and quickly opens the door. After coming out, Ellie angrily walks back to her room. She thinks it's a prank by her parents. Later, Keira talks to Ellie. She says she needs Ellie to look after her brother that night, because they have an important meeting at work. Ellie reluctantly agrees after hearing this. It's nighttime. Ellie is on the phone with her friend. The door behind her suddenly opens on its own. Before Ellie can react, a monster suddenly appears. Ellie looks closer. It turns out her brother, Steven, was just pranking her. Ellie asks her brother, where did he got the mask? Steven says he found it in the storage room. While they are talking, Steven notices an old phonograph in the storage room. It's an old record player. Ellie brings the phonograph out. She wants to see if it still works. She turns it on. A man's voice plays from the speaker. The voice keeps repeating numbers and symbols. After saying the symbols, it starts counting again in a strange way. Ellie thinks it's weird and quickly turns it off. After Steven falls asleep, Ellie watches TV alone in the living room. Suddenly, a strange wind blows from the cellar. Then, the lights go out. Ellie keeps watching TV, but the TV suddenly turns off by itself. The last light flickers and goes out. The whole house is now in total darkness. Scared, Ellie quickly calls her mom. Her mom, Keira, thinks it's just a power issue. She tells Ellie to check the fuse box in the cellar. Ellie hesitates, feeling nervous. She doesn't want to go, but her mom reminds her about her brother. Ellie agrees after hearing this. To help Ellie stay calm, Keira keeps talking to her on the phone. As Ellie enters the cellar, she stares at the dark stairs and hesitates. So Keira gives her a way to stay calm. She tells Ellie that there are 10 steps. She asks Ellie to count each step as she goes down. Ellie follows her mom's advice. At first, nothing happens. But as she reaches the last step, she suddenly closes her eyes and keeps walking. Then, something terrifying happens. Keira thought Ellie had made it safely. But then, she hears Ellie still counting on the phone. That's when she realizes something is wrong. Keira and Brian rush home. As soon as they arrive, they check the cellar, but Ellie is nowhere to be found. With no other choice, they call the police. The next day, they search the area again, but there's no sign of Ellie. Brian thinks Ellie might have run away, but Keira believes something else happened. After some time, Keira puts up missing person posters for Ellie. Then, the sheriff calls. He says they checked all the security cameras nearby, but there were no clues. Keira asks the sheriff to check their house, but he refuses, saying there's no evidence of a crime. Frustrated, Keira goes home and talks to Steven. She asks him what they did before Ellie disappeared. Steven says they played the old record player. Keira looks at the phonograph. She doesn't think it's important. So, she lets Steven keep playing. Then, Keira checks Ellie's personal records. She is shocked to find that Ellie had a strange tattoo. This is a clue, everyone. Since the sheriff won't investigate, Keira takes a UV light and goes into the basement alone. She steps into the dark cellar. As she walks down, she sees numbers carved into each step. On the last step, there's a strange equation. Keira finds it odd, but she keeps walking and shines the UV light. The walls are covered in eerie skull-like patterns. After experts analyze them, the sheriff tells Keira and Brian that the patterns are just old paint. The sheriff then asks them about the house's history. Brian explains that they bought the house at an auction. The previous owner was an elderly woman. She sold the house to pay for her nursing home care. She sold the house to them at a low price because no one had any clues about the house. After a short conversation, the sheriff left. The next morning, Brian wakes up and realizes Keira is missing. He goes to look for her. He finds Keira staring at a door. On the door, he notices a strange symbol. Keira says the symbol is on every door in the house, and each one looks different. She shows Brian the equation. Keira feels like it's connected to Ellie's disappearance, but Brian still believes Ellie ran away. Later, Keira calls the auction house. She wants to ask about the previous owner. They tell her that the original owner was a scholar. His daughter was the one who sold the house. Keira asks for the daughter's address, but they say they don't have it. They promise to look into it. The more Keira studies the equation, the stranger it seems. She takes photos of all the strange symbols. She sends them to her colleagues. She asks them to figure out what language it is, or what type of writing it is. Just as Keira is about to go home, her colleague calls her. They say the symbols are an ancient Siberian script. Each symbol alone doesn't mean anything, but when put together, they form the name of a mythical creature called Leviathan. When Keira gets home, she researches Leviathan, but she still finds no answers. Just when she feels stuck, she notices the phonograph nearby. She turns it on. Suddenly, Stephen's abacus moves on its own. The cabinet behind it swings open by itself as the phonograph starts counting. Stephen begins counting along with it. Then, Stephen walks toward the closet as if he's in a trance. At that moment, Keira hears Stephen counting. She quickly turns off the phonograph and rushes upstairs. Luckily, Keira stops Stephen just in time. The strange part is, Stephen doesn't realize what he's doing. When Keira comes out, she notices a portrait on the wall. She sees the corner of the painting. There's a name written there. The person in the painting is making a strange gesture. The gesture looks odd. Right after, Keira searches for the person's profile online. She finds out that this man was the original owner of the house. As Keira keeps looking, a strange wind blows in the cellar again. Just like when Ellie was there. The lights start flickering and go out. When the power goes out, Keira hears Stephen crying for help. She follows the sound of his cries. She finds Stephen hiding in the cellar. And, as expected, the door still won't open. The key to the cellar is missing. Keira looks around frantically. Then, an eye suddenly appears, and it scares her. Before Keira can calm down, Stephen calls out to his mom. He says he just fell asleep in his room. They hadn't spoken in a while. Then, the cellar door opens on its own. The power comes back on, and the house is lit up again. Keira decides to go to the cellar to check things out. She looks down and sees the key on the door. She picks up the key and goes inside alone. Keira steps into the cellar. She notices that the staircase seems endless. She begins walking down. Suddenly, the door behind her slams shut. Keira tries to open the door, but a dark shadow rushes past her. Keira goes to check, but in her panic, she doesn't realize that her phone falls. Footsteps echo from the cellar. Keira is terrified. She rushes to get Stephen to open the door with the key. But Stephen is too short to reach the key. Just then, Brian arrives at the perfect moment. He quickly opens the door. After some time, Brian asks Keira what happened. Keira says she got trapped in the cellar. Keira sensed an eerie presence in the cellar. She mentioned her missing phone to Brian. Brian didn't take her seriously at all. Because of this, Brian, still doubtful, entered the cellar alone. He searched carefully for the phone. Instead, he stumbled upon a bundle of hair. As he bent down for a closer look, a dark figure swiftly moved past him. He assumed it was a trick of his eyes. Shaking it off, he left the cellar. The next morning arrived. Keira contacted a professor who studied complex equations. As he analyzed the markings, he inquired about where they were found. Keira shared the original owner's name, John. She explained how she discovered it. The professor's reaction showed instant recognition. He revealed that John was a professor of mathematics. However, when John's son became ill, he completely vanished from public life. They continued, discussing the equation in detail. The professor suggested the equation's meaning might connect to multiple dimensions. He pointed out its complexity. He needed more time to study the markings. He advised Keira to wait for his findings. Just as Keira arrived home, the professor called again. His voice was tense as he explained that the equation is actually an unfinished spell. He added more troubling news. A colleague had found the same equation in Belgium. The markings were identical to hers. The family who had lived there had vanished entirely without a trace. Keira felt a wave of dread at the connection. It mirrored what was happening in her own house. She desperately tried explaining this to Brian, but after hearing her out, he insisted that they were meaningless decorations. Keira, frustrated, led Brian to the cellar. She pointed at the numbers and symbols. She repeated what the professor had explained. Brian believed Keira was too fixated on Ellie. Frustrated, he grabbed a hammer and struck the wall. But something strange happened next. When it hit the floor, a metallic clang echoed. Without warning, the phonograph began playing. In another room, Stephen was playing a game. He suddenly noticed a shadow inside the closet. Stephen hesitated before whispering. The figure inside the closet lifted its head slowly. A chill ran down his spine as he screamed for his mother. Keira and Brian rushed upstairs as Stephen pointed at the closet. He swore the figure resembled Ellie. Brian cautiously checked the closet. He didn't find Ellie, but he found her phone. Finally, Brian understood that Keira was right. Keira followed the leads and found John's daughter. She successfully located her. At first, John's daughter refused to share any details. But when Keira revealed Ellie's disappearance, she hesitated. She quietly wrote the word Leviathan. She explained that Leviathan was one of Hell's 7 princes. She spoke about how her brother had been terribly ill. Their father, desperate, had summoned the demon into this world. Keira's heart pounded as she asked if Ellie's still trapped in the cellar. The woman explained that it wasn't just about the cellar. The entire house was a gateway between hell and earth. Meanwhile, Brian made a shocking discovery. He arranged the symbols and realized the triangle at the base formed a pentagram. When Keira returned home, Brian immediately showed her his findings. He also uncovered another disturbing truth. The idea of Leviathan as Poseidon was a deception. The true Leviathan was actually a demon called Baphomet. This entity was Hell's gatekeeper, standing between realms. Just then, their drone suddenly spun out of control. Brian followed its erratic path. He didn't realize what was coming. Meanwhile, Keira picked up the phonograph. She suspected it was linked to Ellie's disappearance. As Keira turned it on, Stephen, standing in the cellar, suddenly collapsed, but this time, he regained consciousness immediately after falling. He reached for the fallen drone. Turning around, he saw a demon watching him. Right after, an eerie wind swept past Keira. She and Brian both sensed something was wrong with Stephen. They frantically searched the house, but Stephen was nowhere to be found. As panic set in, Keira suddenly heard Stephen murmuring. Following his voice, they rushed towards him. They found Stephen standing at the entrance of the cellar. Seeing his pale face filled Keira with fear. She asked Brian to get him some water. Keira pressed her hand to Stephen's forehead. He was burning with fever. As she went to remove his shirt, a pentagram pattern suddenly appeared on his chest. Before Keira could react, Stephen started reciting numbers again, but this time, it was a countdown. Horrified, Keira turned to Brian for help. But Brian had also started repeating the countdown as the final numbers approached. Brian spoke in a trance, saying, "He is coming." Heavy footsteps echoed from below. Realizing the danger, Keira hid under a table. Moments later, a shadowy demon crept from the darkness. But after a moment, its steps came to an eerie stop. Keira hesitated, then slowly stood up, determined to find Ellie. She ignored the risks and ran into the cellar. Oddly, no matter how far Keira walked, the stairs never seemed to end. She lifted her flashlight and took a photo of the endless steps. Keira realized the stairs stretched endlessly. Through her camera, she spotted a hidden room. She stepped inside and found a long, dark tunnel. Emerging from the tunnel, she saw thousands of people standing in line. Every single one of them was whispering numbers. Keira's heart sank as she scanned the crowd. The chance of finding Ellie among them felt as impossible as finding a needle in a haystack. Just as she was about to lose hope, she caught a glimpse of Ellie's tattoo. Keira pushed through the crowd to confirm. Sure enough, it was Ellie. But Ellie's eyes were vacant, and she kept reciting numbers. Seeing this, Keira grabbed Ellie and hurried away. Reaching the cellar, they tried to shut the door behind them, but the demon appeared before they could. In a panic, Keira used the flashlight to fend it off. The creature recoiled and backed away, but the flashlight slipped from her hands and landed outside. Back home, Keira and Ellie both slowly regained awareness, but something felt off. As Keira prepared to leave the house with her family, she noticed something on the ground. It was the flashlight she had lost earlier. Suspicious, she stepped forward and opened the door again. To her horror, she realized they had never escaped. In the final moments, Keira, Brian, and Ellie resumed counting. They silently joined the line, walking back into the cellar. And with that, the story came to a chilling end.